Hi there, Bill Hitchcock. Here it is, January 24th, and on this day at 5 p.m., the speckled trout fishery along the coast of North Carolina is getting shut down. And the reason why it's getting shut down is because of a cold stun event, something we haven't had in 7 or 8 years. Consequently, this is the proclamation issued by Kathy Rawls, the director of the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries. This is what we're going to be talking about. We have interviewed Lucas Pensinger just less than an hour ago. We're trying to get this out to you before the actual closure happens. He is the biologist supervisor for the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries. We're going to talk about everything about the cold stun event, why speckled trout get this happens to them, where it happens to them, how long this closure is going to be. I'll give you a hint. Summertime when the living is easy. Trout looks like it's going to be shut down. I do want to show you this. This is again from the Division of Marine Fisheries. This is for joint and coastal waters, not inland waters. Now this map here is from the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries. All the red that you see are coastal waters, and I want to give you an example right here that where you see the blue and the black lines. That's not coastal. This proclamation does not pertain there. But we'll talk about that a little later on, that you might want to, because we want these speckled trout to grow and get big and all that kind of stuff. Enough of me. I want to jump right on into this interview with Lucas Pensinger. He's the biologist supervisor for the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries. I did a Zoom call with him, so we're going to go to that Zoom call right now.
We have just had what is referred to as a cold stun event. And that's where Mr. Fishy, as the name implies, gets cold and it gets stunned. What is that? One, two, why is it that we always just seem to hear about speckled trout?
So those are phenomenal questions. Really, a cold stun is just when water temperatures fall below what a fish can handle. It can technically happen to any fish. It just more commonly happens to spotted sea trout. There is something in their biology that when water temperatures get cold, they lose their ability to keep themselves upright in the water. So we call it orientation. They lose their ability to orient, which just means they kind of don't know which way is up and down. They don't know if they're flopped over on their side or if they're floating belly up. Usually when that happens, a fish can get itself righted so that it can swim off. When water temperatures get too cold, spotted sea trout can no longer do that, and they just have trouble moving in general.
For the past week or so here on the program, I wish I had the study in front of me. Here I am unprepared, but I've been saying at 39.5 degrees Fahrenheit is when a speckled trout gets stunned, and I might have this a little off by a degree, and at 38.5 degrees they can die, and the longer they're in that environment, the more higher the possibility of them dying. Is that close to accurate?
Yeah, definitely. So Tim Ellis, who actually works for wildlife resources, in his PhD work, he did a lot of studying spotted sea trout, and this was a big part of his one of the chapters of his dissertation was looking at the minimum temperatures that spotted sea trout can handle before they die. I mean, we say cold stunned, and some trout that are cold stunned can recover if water temperatures come back up soon enough. But a lot of them don't. Most of them do end up dying. So when we say cold stun, we're not necessarily talking only about dead fish. But these events can lead to those mass mortality events. So what Tim found is that when spotted sea trout experience temperatures, water temperatures of 37.4 degrees Fahrenheit for 24 hours or more, that's when they start dying off pretty quickly.
Let me interrupt. Now, where are we finding these waters that maintain 37.5 degrees? It's got to be shallow. It's got to be on the inside, I would assume.
Yes. So this is part of what makes spotted sea trout especially susceptible to cold stuns. In the winter, they tend to push really far up into the creeks. and some of the bays, but mostly up into the creeks. And what they're looking for is just that we call it a thermal refuge, but they're just looking for deeper pockets that stay warm. Anybody who's fished for spotted sea trout in the winter knows, you go far enough up in the creek and you look for deep holes, and you're gonna find them stacked up pretty thick there. So that's great in a normal North Carolina winter. The problem is they have to go through a lot of shallow water to get to those deeper holes in the creek. And if the water gets cold enough, especially if it gets cold enough fast enough, they just can't get out of those areas, and they get trapped in water that is shallow enough that basically from top to bottom, you don't get that difference in temperature between the top and the bottom.
Right.
We
let
would
me
call
ask you
it
this.
a gradient.
Fish like red drum, like oftentimes during the fall time of the year or springtime of the year, speckled trout and red drum are in the same place. But this time of year, red drum are migrating out to the ocean. Is that correct?
Yep, especially the bigger breeding ones. Some of the smaller immature ones are staying in the estuary. But yeah, those big breeders absolutely are moving offshore this time of year. That's actually our fall drum run is when they're schooling up to start moving out of the estuary, is when people are getting into those big bull drum in the fall.
Let me ask you this, and hopefully I don't go on too many tangents here.
That's
What
all
other
good.
fish overwinter in these creeks that would be affected by a cold stun event? That's one. And two, I have not heard of a cold stun event offshore in years. Do we? Because this time of year, we've been talking a lot about this Labrador currents wrapping around the point of Hatteras, and the warmest waters are pushing in there to Raleigh Bay between Hatteras and Ocracoke. So now we've got this convergence of cold water, warm water, boom, fish can get stunned. Do you know in proximity of the last time that's happened offshore? And again, to my original question, what other fish get affected back in the creeks during the January, February time period during this cold stuns?
So offshore, it would be a lot less likely just because you have more water depth. And water, the deeper that it can be, the more stable those temperatures are going to be at the bottom. So like those surface temperatures might change, pretty drastically in the winter, especially with cold weather and such. But down deep, it's pretty darn stable. So they're not changing very much.
Right.
So it's just, I'm not saying it couldn't happen in the in the ocean, but it's just much, much less likely to happen. I don't know that I've ever heard of cold stun fish outside of estuarine waters. And the estuarine waters, just like the creeks, the bays, the rivers that feed into the sounds.
What about on the inside? We've got speckled trout that are being affected. What other little fishies are back there?
So we do see striped mullet are probably the most common one, and it's just because they're in similar areas. They tend to be moving around a little bit more, and kind of get out of the areas that might get a little too cold. So we don't see that as often. And as some of these other fishes, like your red drums and such, they're definitely in the same areas. And we do with a really bad cold stun. So like 2018 was a real bad cold stun. And we certainly saw dead red drum as well. There probably aren't quite as many of them, and they're a little more spread out. Spotted sea trout tend to really aggregate and kind of stack up. So if it's going to affect them, it's probably going to affect more of them. But really,
you know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of late, like August, September, when the water temperatures get real high and the dissolved oxygen goes bye-bye, and menhaden get trapped in these creeks, and there's no oxygen, and they die. It sounds somewhat like. So what about? I want to jump into this real quick. Do we find what are some of the variables? Are males with speckled trout, are males affected more than females? I would assume any juvenile would have a less potential of survival than an adult, but I would also assume that the larger the speckled trout, the more hardier he would be. Is that consistent with what your findings?
So that is consistent with what Tim Ellis found in his. Now, most of his research was, I think, laboratory research for this. So it's a little bit different. You're not seeing the predation factor, both by us, so humans, but also just birds and other fish, animals, things along those, like anything. Everybody's looking for an easy meal. So Tim did find that smaller fish were, if I'm remembering his research correctly, smaller fish were slightly more affected. So bigger fish were a little bit hardier.
Right.
I don't know that that's actually what we've seen, but I will caveat that with we definitely get cold stuns, and this is anywhere. Texas in I think it's either 2020 or 2021 when they had that really cold weather. They had a horrible cold stun down there. But trying to quantify how many fish have died is just so difficult because most of them don't float up until a couple days, maybe even longer later. It takes time for gas to build up in them so that they actually float.
Let me stop you there. That I'm so glad you
Yep.
brought that up. So over a period, let's say on day one, I'm just going to make up say 100 fish die on day one. Not all of them are going to be on top. Some of
Not
them are
all
going to
of them.
be down on the bottom. Is there any idea or is there any rationale, any handle we can get on that if you see 10 on top, there's 90 on the bottom, or 90 on top, there's 10 on the bottom? Any type of scale, I'll say, that we can use like that?
I wish there was, because it would make it a lot easier to
Yeah,
quantify these events. But
right.
there's really not. I know in I think it was the 2010 one. Now that was well before my time with the division. But I think in the 2010 cold stun event, it was either 10 or 11. It was the first one where the director of the Division of Marine Fisheries actually closed the fishery. And he got I believe it was Steve Murphy, Director Murphy at that time.
Mhm.
He was given a very, very hard time for that because we hadn't seen that many dead fish yet. We had seen enough that he felt comfortable closing the fishery.
Right.
But it wasn't until 2 or 3 days later that, as people, in some of our sampling efforts, we were pulling trawls, and in other fishing efforts with folks pulling trawls, all of a sudden they were scooping up just tons and tons of dead spotted sea trout. And from what we had seen at the surface and from what had like floated up to shore and such, it looked like it was bad, but maybe not horribly bad. But
Right.
a couple of days later, every time somebody pulled a trawl, it was full I mean, full might be a bit of an overstatement, but there were a whole bunch of dead trout every time somebody was out there pulling anything that came even close to the bottom. Um,
You used the magic cuss word, proclamation. We just had Kathy Rawls, the director of the division,
yes.
North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries, just issued a proclamation 2 days ago, I think it was, about
Yep.
the speckled trout, sea trout fishery is shut down here in North Carolina for both commercial and recreational. Several questions for you. One, does that pertain to this if I was surf fishing or off of a pier? Or is that just
Yes.
possession, period?
So it is in any coastal and joint waters of North Carolina.
Okay. Now
It
you
is.
made mention about a trawl just a few seconds ago. Is that you? Are you talking about the division going out and trawling for the speckled trout to see to get to what's going on?
So that was actually not trawling for speckled trout. At that time, we have a juvenile trawl survey that we're looking for juvenile fish. So it's a real thin mesh trawl, and we have a bunch of stations where we're pulling that. We're just looking for juvenile of basically all the species we manage and everything else that's there,
So the
but geared
division
towards
did
smaller fish.
the division did use a trawl to sample to see what was out there.
Yes, but not for dead spotted sea trout. That just happened to be that's what we were finding.
Gotcha. Oh, understood.
The idea with that sampling is a juvenile finfish sampling program. It actually doesn't happen in the winter anymore. A combination of, it's just more dangerous to be out on the water those times, but also catches are super, super low. There aren't a lot of the real small. I mean, when we say juvenile, we're talking like tiny juveniles, not like, small, not quite mature yet, not quite adults. We're not talking teenage fish. We're talking like baby fish there.
So what is the rationale or the process that the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries employs to determine to issue a proclamation to shut down the fishery? And I'm specifically talking about speckled trout right now.
Yep.
What goes, whoops, we've crossed that line. What is that line that's crossed that warrants a proclamation?
That is a great question. Great question. And that's the hot topic question of the day, quite frankly, is where is that line drawn? Our protocols for monitoring in general the spotted sea trout fishery in the winter, but definitely for shutting it down, involve two different approaches. And it's an either or an and or situation. So either one of those approaches, if it reaches that threshold of significance, could lead to that proclamation. So the first one is just dead fish. If we're seeing enough dead fish in enough areas, and I think that we've put numbers on it in the past and we've taken numbers off it in the past. I think it is 50 fish, 50 or more dead fish in multiple water bodies. So it has to be like two or more, or at least I shouldn't say it has to be, but we look for two or more distinct water bodies with that.
Right.
And our current management has the state broken into three different regions. So it's kind of the Albemarle and the rivers that feed into the Albemarle, the Pamlico Sound and the rivers that feed into that, and then everything south of there. So there's kind of three different spotted sea trout management regions. If we're seeing significant numbers of dead fish, so like 50 or more multiple places in two of those regions, at that point, it's probably no matter what water temperatures are doing, we're at least considering, we're having discussions about whether it makes sense to issue that proclamation or not. The other side is those water temperatures. So if water temperatures get below 37.4 degrees for 24 hours or more, or below 41 degrees for a period of 8 days or more, in those situations, it's pretty likely that spotted sea trout are going to start dying. And to help us monitor that, we actually have, I just looked these numbers up yesterday and now I forget them, which is terrible.
No worries.
We have, I think it's currently 77 water temperature loggers deployed throughout the state in something like 50, I want to say 59, but that might be a little high, like 50 couple different stations.
Right.
And those stations tend to be where spotted sea trout winter habitat is. So we have some in the mouths of these
By the way,
creeks.
Lucas, you're not giving away fishing hole secrets, are you?
No. I mean, I think if I am, it's they're secrets. I think they're any that I would be giving away are pretty widely known.
At what depth are these readings taken?
That's a great question too. It depends. Where a station is shallow enough, we have them. We want them deep enough that they're not coming out of the water,
right?
Or at least not consistently, which sometimes can be hard, especially with these cold stun events, because they often follow periods where we're having stronger tides or winds that are really blowing water out of areas. Because if we have consistent winds that are blowing water, pushing water out, these areas in the backs of the creeks are getting more and more shallow,
Right.
which means it's more and more likely that all of that water, there's not going to be warmer water sitting on the bottom anymore. All of that water is going to be a pretty similar temperature. So there's nowhere for trout to go to, they can't go deeper to get away from it. And that's actually what we saw in some places in this current cold. I would say we're still experiencing it, quite frankly.
Well, as we're recording this, I looked at the weather forecast. We've had at least a week of 20 to 30, rarely 40-degree air temperatures. I looked at the week ahead, and it's pretty much the same thing.
Yep.
So those shallow waters will be affected. Do you have any idea off the top of your head? Is there like a safe zone? Let's say, look, after 3 feet or 2 feet or 4 feet of water depth, screw the air temperatures. Now I'm going to be safe down here. Is there any rule of thumb like that?
The deeper, the better, really. Just because the deeper that water is, the harder it is for it to turn over. So when it turns over and it mixes, that's where that water kind of becomes the same temperature the whole way top to bottom. The more mixing that happens, which can be because of wind a lot of times,
Right.
can be because of tides in some areas where tides are strong enough to do that. Usually back up in the creeks, though, that's going to be driven by wind. If
now,
the wind
also the other thing, now back up in those creeks, the water salinity is going to be different than, say, if you're in Pamlico Sound and obviously out in the ocean. How does salinity play into this?
So salinity, honestly, I'm not sure that anybody has actually looked at that. Mostly because a lot of these places were just generally fresher. However, as probably a lot of folks know, I mean, this probably isn't going to be news to most folks hearing this. We've had some pretty wicked salt wedges the past couple years that have just been pushing further and further up the streams, or up the rivers, I should say.
Interesting.
And a lot of that is just lack of rain. We haven't had a lot of rain to push that water back out. So water is saltier a lot of places that it just hasn't been before. And I don't know that would necessarily have an effect. It seems like this is mostly temperature driven.
Let me ask you this. Let me ask you this, because we're going to be time is flying by here. If you see a stunned fish, he's on his side on the surface. It does not necessarily mean he is dead. Is that correct? 1, and 2, does that mean therefore he can recover?
So that's a tough one, because yes, in theory, that fish can recover. But this is where I was kind of talking a little bit about the difference between Tim's work in the lab and then transporting that into nature. In theory, if water temperatures come back up, that fish can absolutely recover. The problem is that would have to happen before something that wants to eat and or harvest that fish comes across it.
Speaking of eating, by the way, if I'm motivating down the Pungo or wherever, Goose Creek, and I see, a speckled trout that's on his side, can I pick it up and eat it? Because the number one thing that I'm thinking about is I'm assuming it was a cold stun that created that fish to float up there. Might have been some other external factor, but I mean, can you do that though? If it's a cold stun fish, can you eat it?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, with the caveat of at 5 p.m. this evening, harvest closes, so no, you can't after that. But up until 5 p.m. this evening, there is nothing. You can harvest your legal limit within the license that you hold and legal gears in the area you're in. So if you are a commercial fisher,
you can harvest and you can eat.
Limit. Yep.
You can harvest and you can eat when it's an open. Again, thank you for bringing that back up. Right now, we have a proclamation in effect. Any idea? Well, what do you do? What do you look for to go look? It's safe now. I mean, is it again? It's the water temperature thing that is over X period of time. It's been X temperature. It's now okay.
So you're talking to like reopen the fishery?
Yeah.
So that's actually tied to spotted sea trout spawning. So what we're trying to do with that closure is just reduce pressure on them. Let any fish that survives the cold stun itself have an opportunity to spawn in that spring and into the summer. So once the fishery is closed from a cold stun, it'll remain closed. Currently, the protocols for that are through June 15th. One of the things that was actually included in the draft of Amendment 1, so we're working on Amendment 1 to the Spotted Sea Trout Fishery Management Plan. It will be in front of the Marine Fisheries Commission at their February business meeting for final approval and adoption. In November, they selected their preferred management options before sending it out for public comment, and then it goes for legislative review as well. Our recommendation, the division's recommendation, and what the commission selected in their preferred management option would actually look to extend that closure. Currently, it's at June 15th. We would look to extend it through the end of June, just because that gets through peak spotted sea trout spawning is generally over by the end of June. So extending that closure to the end of June actually gets us through all of the peak spawn. As it is right now, we're kind of reopening things right in the middle of that peak spawn. So, as we were developing that plan, we like the idea of getting it the whole way through that spawn, give that many more fish that much of a chance to spawn, help the population recover. Thankfully, spotted sea trout are a resilient fish. They recover quickly.
So biologically speaking, what's best for the speckled trout population is to have a closure through basically the end of June. Is that correct?
Yeah, it gets them through that peak spawning period. And they'll continue to spawn through the rest of the summer. It's just less so, not quite as heavily as they do through the end of June.
One of the things that I've been making mention of for at least a month, if not 2 months here, there's been 2 species of fish that have been humongous this season. One's been bluefin tuna. Bluefin tuna is up to 1,000 pounds, 600, 700, 800, 900,000 pound bluefin tunas, which I've never heard of so many caught here off the coast of North Carolina. And I used to be the coordinator of the Tag a Giant Bluefin Tuna Conservation Series. And then speckled trout. I have not heard, and yes, a lot of it has to do, we have better reporting. We got the internet, the interwebs, where we can find in the Facebook, things like that out, but I haven't heard of so many in a long time. What does a cold stun affects? How does that affect size? Are we going to now go through a couple of years of smaller ones?
We might. It's hard to say, really. If I had to guess, I would say yes. That's exactly what we'll see. We will see. There will still be some of those bigger fish, but I would imagine for a couple years they're going to be a lot more rare than they have been lately. Now, if this is a stun that happens to affect smaller fish more, I don't know that we'll know that until we see how many, the breakdown of the fish that we're catching.
Right.
But yeah, I would guess a lot of smaller fish are on the horizon.
Unfortunately, Lucas, Mr. Zoom is telling me I've run out of time, so we're going to have to go. We've been talking with Lucas Pensinger about the cold stun that we're in the midst of in the proclamation. Lucas, thanks for talking with us.
Oh, no problem, Bill. Anytime.
I certainly would like to thank Lucas Pensinger, the biologist supervisor for the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries. I want to make sure that we've got the Marine Patrol telephone number out, that in case you're out and about on the water this wintertime, if you see dead trout, if you see stunned trout, give them a call. That's 252-515-5507. Again, 252-515-5507. Got the text underneath that. Email me, billhitchcock@mail.com, billhitchcock@mail.com, billhitchcock@mail.com. If you have any other questions that I didn't ask Lucas that you would like for me to get back in touch with him about, Also, it looks like possibly, the end of June before they'll open up the speckled trout fishery here in North Carolina, and I have no problem with it. Let these things spawn and grow and do whatever. Also in these open and closed areas, as we showed at the top of the show, the open waters, or the coastal waters, excuse me, for North Carolina, the joint and coastal are marked in red here. I wouldn't, please don't be encouraged to go speckled trout fishing where it's inland waters. Well, the North Carolina Wildlife Commission said I could. Well, how about let these fish grow? Just me. Anyway, send your questions and comments to the email address or post them here at YouTube. I'm Bill Hitchcock. Until next time.